Enough for all, challenging inequality. That's the theme that we're about to dive into over the next few weeks. That's the theme that's being begun at Camp Cazadero as well, as we look at this story of the loaves and the fishes, one of the most wonderful examples of an image of abundance in a story where people think there's scarcity. That is where we're headed. Challenging inequality. This is a huge task to take on. It's a huge task. We can see it. We can see it all around us in our culture and in our world. We can see that things are not equal. Now, how do we take this on? Such a complicated topic, where you could look at one set of economic data or another set of economic data and come to completely opposite conclusions about the way things should work, the way things might work. How do we approach this subject in a time where it feels like it's such a big systemic thing that the only solutions are going to be happening at the highest levels of our government when governance is not working? How do we take on this task when we might have different approaches to it based on our theologies or our financial situation or our politics? How do we approach this question? It's a challenge. We live in a market economy, and there are certain aspects of the market economy that create a lot of freedom, which is a good thing. But there are other aspects of market economies that make things more challenging, and especially in the way that economics are playing out at this particular time in our culture and our history. We know that that's a big thing to be thinking about, a big thing to be looking at. But this thing seems to be true, according to the data, that this is a time of one of the most disparate spaces between the rich and the poor, and that the wealth is becoming more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer people, and that is having effects throughout our economy, throughout our communities. And I would guess that in this very crowd, we have people all along the scale, people who are just getting by, people who are doing fine, and people who are doing quite well. So I wouldn't presume that as we talk today that we're talking even from the same kind of place in relationship to these financial challenges. How hard is it right now for us? Are we just barely holding it together? How much financial anxiety are we carrying? And because as a people, I believe, we tend to work, no matter how many resources we have, we tend to work pretty close to using up the resources that we have, so we're always in just a slight sense of there isn't enough. It doesn't matter how much you make or how little you make, because of the way we live, the choices that we make, we are challenged. We just find that challenge. But there is a difference, of course, between having $20,000 a year and having $60,000 or $100,000, regardless of our subjective experience of that. So some things seem to be happening in our culture, in our market economy. The first thing I'd like to say, to take this on at this level, we could actually approach the idea of income inequality from a lot of different levels. We could be looking at it as more of a social justice question that may need certain sorts of solutions that we may see more immediately around us. And many people, many groups, many nonprofits, many organizations are trying to deal with some of the pieces to help with the challenges that come in these economic times. But if we don't look at that bigger question of the way that our system works, it seems to me that we're going to be treading water in terms of our ability to make it happen. And yet, what influence do we have on this larger debate that goes on right now? So there's a part of our people who are pretty concerned about themselves and theirs. The circle is close in. That circle of concern is close in. And probably for good reasons, perhaps for some survival reasons. But it's a little difficult economically to think about how we're interrelated, how we're connected, because we're trying to make it work for ourselves. And there are people who politically believe that it's not their job to be concerned about others, that we are supposed to be self-reliant, we're supposed to make it on our own. And if we do or don't make it, it's because something about our self-worth. And yet we know at a fundamental level that the way things are working are not the way that they might even work, even if you were completely on board with the way market economies work. So there was research done at some point, and people were asked to describe how they thought wealth was distributed amongst the population, and we're just talking about the United States now. And people gave their opinions. They just said, well, I think there are probably about this many people in this group, and this many people in this group, and this many. And there was a fair amount of wealth concentrated in those upper levels, and there's a part of our value system that says those people are being rewarded because of the things that they've done. And yet, when asked when they saw the charts about how that had worked, and then they were asked, well, how do you think it should be? They distributed the income even more fairly. So the way we think that wealth is distributed is even different than the way we think it should be, it turns out. That our perceptions of that, number one, our perceptions of that are not very good. And number two, we probably carry with us a sense that actually things should be a little bit more distributed than they are. And then they were shown the actual economic data about the distribution of wealth. And it turns out that those lower quarters of the population had a smaller and smaller and smaller amount of the total wealth. And you could just see this curve. It starts very low down here, and it stays low for quite a while, and then at the end it goes, and not just like, it's like, it was that dramatic. And there are a couple of videos that I'm going to link to on the website so you can see these kind of graphic representations. So we have our ideas about the way things should work in our culture, how things should be distributed. We have what we hope they would be, and then we have the reality, and those things don't match up. And when they looked at the data about the way that we think things ought to be, they looked at questions of political point of view and income, and there was one other, I can't remember what the other, I think it was maybe gender. And it turned out that everyone's perception of the way things ought to be, that they were not that much different. This was done, I think, in 2005, and so the political category were people who voted for Kerry, people who voted for Bush. And it turned out that even along these political lines, that it didn't vary that much what their idea of the way it should be. So what that says to me, that even though we might disagree politically about how we come about this, that actually our ideas about the way it should work are really not all that much different. So why don't things change if that's the case, if that's what we think, if that's what we believe? Well, it's because there's a relationship between economics and politics. There's a relationship between who has resources and what they can do with those resources, and who they can influence, and who gets to write the legislation, and who's supporting political candidates. This is clouding the picture. Earlier in the summer, I preached at one point on integrity and at another point about outrage. And when I look at these questions, both of those things come up for me. I feel like there are things that just aren't fair. What happened to fairness? And I can just feel my frustration rising around that. Even if we don't think that everyone should be actually equal, the dreaded socialism, even with our ideas about the way things should work in our culture that turn out where we don't even disagree that much politically, still we cannot change the conversation. And the political conversation is also clouded by language, that we find ways to name things so that it skews things in one way or another. So we talk about job creators instead of really, 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 really rich people. You can see that this would be a marketing challenge. Or we talk about redistribution of wealth. And you can just kind of imagine, someone coming in, a thief in the night, and grabbing the bags of money that you've piled up in your closet, and sneaking away in the middle of the night, your bags of money, and taking it over here, and giving it to someone who doesn't deserve it. That's just what the language does when you use language like that. And we talk about small business. People keep invoking small business. And I don't know about you, but when I think about small business, I think, let's see, that would be the corner grocery store in Bloomington, Indiana in 1963. Mom and pop, couple of maybe 3 employees. That's my picture of a small business. And yet, according to the Small Business Administration, you can have revenues, depending on what business you're in, of $15, $20 million. You can have 1,500 employees. It's not really what we're thinking of, I don't think, when people use that language. So no one invokes corporations. They don't say, well, this would be really good for corporations. They say, well, let's talk about the small businesses. Let's talk about Main Street, which also kind of evokes kind of a pristine image. It certainly doesn't make us think about poor people. Who is talking about poor people in the national government at this point? Bernie Sanders. I think he's the only one. That's the way it seems. No one is bringing to our attention, to our mind, the plight of poor people. As Christians, this is not right. I don't care what your political point of view is. We have a responsibility, it seems to me, according to what I read in the Scripture, we have an obligation to our brothers and sisters. We have an obligation. When one person suffers, we all suffer. When one person rejoices, we all rejoice. Our livelihood, our fullness, our health, our well-being is intimately tied to other people. All other people, and not just the people we always hang out with, but people we hardly know. And until, I think, we take on some of this responsibility to really claim that this is such an important part of the gospel message, that there is enough for all. It doesn't seem like it. It seems like, there's only one can of tuna and one loaf of bread. But I'm pretty sure in the world there's lots and lots and lots of tuna, and lots and lots and lots of bread. And how are we going to work our way to a place where it feels like everyone has at least a little bit more access? So much is changing in our world. There are kind of deep systemic things that have happened in American culture over the last 40 or 50 years, the collapse of the industrial sector, which was a place that a lot of people found jobs with small sets of skills that could move them into the middle class. The middle class isn't growing in income, which means they're extending themselves financially, then they're borrowing money on the equity in their homes, and then we have a housing bubble, and then it all collapses. And the people who have orchestrated financial instruments that are, talk about lack of integrity. It's shocking. It's shocking to me that those things can happen and that they still happen. We have not learned the lesson of the last economic crisis. It's complicated. It is. It's complex. But there are some simple truths to this, that we are connected, that we do have a responsibility to each other. Regardless of how we approach that politically or socially, we are connected, and everyone needs to be fed. So a group of 5,000 people gathered on a hillside to hear Jesus preach. And then it became dinner time. And Jesus said, well, I've got a bunch of bread and I've got a bunch of fish, but it's really only enough for probably 250 of you. So if you could just come over in this one spot, And actually, 50 of you are going to get most of the bread and the fish, and the rest of the 250 are going to get some bread and fish. And then when you're done eating, then the rest of the people, someone do the math, it's like 4,750 of you. You get the crumbs. That's not the way that story went down. Amen.